The snow began falling at dusk on October 31st, 1893 in Lewiston, Maine. By 7 o'clock, it had laid a clean white skin over the granite steps that climbed the hill toward St. Joseph's Church. The mills along the Androscoggin River had closed early for the holiday, and the neighborhood streets held only the muffled sound of children in scarves and coats, carrying carved turnips with candles inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and the cold, metallic bite of early winter. The child lived in a narrow clapboard house halfway up Church Street, where the incline made walking feel like work even on dry days. The family kept a jack-o'-lantern in the parlor window, its face carved with triangle eyes and a crooked smile. Inside, the mother had wrapped penny candies in squares of waxed paper and placed them in a tin pail painted orange. The child carried that pail outside at 7:30, planning to walk 3 houses up to visit the widow who always gave out maple sugar. The mother watched from the doorway. She saw the child take the first 5 steps, small boots pressing perfect prints into the snow. The pail swung gently at the child's side. Then she turned back inside to stir the pot of cider warming on the stove. She heard the door knock again a moment later and assumed the child had forgotten something. When she opened the door, no one stood there. The snow on the steps lay smooth and unbroken, except for the 5 small footprints ascending. No prints descended. No prints led away to either side. And there, centered on the 7th step, sat the orange tin pail. The mother reached down and touched the metal handle. It was warm, as though small fingers had just released it. She called the child's name. The wind carried it up the hill, past the dark houses where candles flickered in windows. No answer came back. She stepped onto the stoop and looked both ways along Church Street. A group of children passed 2 blocks down, their laughter sharp in the cold air. None of them wore the gray coat she had buttoned that evening. None carried a turnip lantern. The mother climbed the steps following the 5 prints until they stopped. She stood at the 7th step and turned in a slow circle. Behind her, the street showed no trace of running feet or dragging marks. Ahead, the snow lay perfect all the way to the church. To her left and right, the neighboring yards remained untroubled by any path. She picked up the pail and felt the warmth spread into her palm. Inside, the candies sat undisturbed, their wax paper smooth and folded. She went to the widow's house and knocked. The old woman opened the door holding a bowl of hazelnuts. She had seen no child that evening. She had been sitting by her own fire, waiting, but no one had come. The mother described the gray coat, the small boots, the orange pail. The widow shook her head. She had heard nothing on the steps outside her door, and her hearing was still sharp enough to catch the mill whistle from 2 miles off. By 8 o'clock, the father had returned from knocking on every door within 4 blocks. No one had seen the child leave the 5th step. A neighbor who lived across the street said he had been watching from his own window smoking his pipe, and he swore he saw nothing unusual. He saw the mother open the door the first time, saw the child step out, then looked away to tap ash into a dish. When he glanced back, the door was closed and the street was empty. He thought nothing of it. Children moved quickly on Halloween night. The men gathered lanterns and began walking the streets in pairs. They called the child's name into alleys and checked behind wood piles and under porches. They searched the basement of the church and the cold storage shed behind the general store. They walked down to the canal locks and scanned the dark water, though ice had not yet formed and the current ran fast enough that anything fallen in would have been carried downstream within minutes. At 9 o'clock, someone noticed the jack-o'-lantern in the parlor window. It had turned. When the mother had placed it that afternoon, the carved face looked out toward the street. Now it faced inward, toward the room, as though watching the empty chairs and the cold fireplace. She insisted she had not touched it. The father checked the sill and found no sign that anyone had reached through from outside. The window was latched from within. One of the neighbors, a man who worked the night shift at the Bates mill, suggested they check the church bell tower. He had heard the bell ring earlier that evening, which struck him as odd because the sexton never rang it after sunset on weekdays. The group climbed the hill through snow that was now ankle-deep. Inside the church, they found the sexton sitting in the front pew with his coat still on. He had not rung the bell. He had been there since 6 o'clock, preparing the interior for All Saints' Day Mass in the morning. They climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower anyway. The bell hung silent in the cold air, its iron surface beaded with moisture. The rope that controlled it lay coiled on the wooden floor, undisturbed. But when the sexton counted the knots he had tied in it that morning, a habit he kept to prevent fraying, he found 13 instead of 12. He was certain he had tied 12. He always tied 12, one for each apostle. He had done it that way for 30 years. The men stood in the tower and looked out over the town. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray lines. The river reflected a few scattered lights from the mills that burned coal through the night to keep pipes from freezing. The streets below showed the crisscross paths of the search parties, their lanterns moving like slow fireflies through the snow. No one spoke about the extra knot. No one touched the bell rope. They descended and spread out into a wider search. Some men walked the train tracks that ran parallel to the river. Others checked the carriage houses and the root cellars behind the larger homes on Main Street. A few crossed the bridge and searched the far bank, though the snow there remained unbroken except for deer prints leading down to the water's edge. At 10 o'clock, the constable arrived from his house near the old French Quarter. He took a statement from the mother in the parlor, while the father stood by the fireplace, turning the orange pail in his hands. The constable wrote down the time the child had left the house, the direction of the intended walk, the description of the clothing. He noted that the snow had begun at dusk and had fallen steadily, which meant any prints made before 7:30 would have been covered. But the 5 ascending prints remained clear, which meant they had been made after the snow had established itself, and nothing had descended. He asked if the family had any disputes with neighbors. The father shook his head. He asked if the child had ever run away before. The mother said no, never, not even to hide during a scolding. He asked if anyone had come to the door earlier that day, selling goods or asking for work. No one had. The constable walked outside and stood at the base of the steps. He counted the 5 prints ascending and then knelt at the 7th step where the pail had been found. He brushed his gloved hand across the snow and found it undisturbed beneath. No compression, no slight hollow where something might have landed after being thrown. The pail had been set down, not dropped or tossed. He touched the handle. It still held a trace of warmth, though more than 2 hours had passed since the child had last held it. He looked up at the street. The snow fell in loose flakes now, softer than before, and it was already beginning to fill in the searchers' boot prints. By morning, the evidence would be gone. He asked the men to mark the 5 ascending prints with stakes driven into the ground on either side, careful not to disturb the snow itself. 4 men worked by lantern light, pushing thin wooden stakes into the frozen earth until the prints were caged in place like relics. Someone suggested checking the attic. The family had no attic, only a crawl space too low for an adult to stand in. They checked it anyway. It was empty except for an old trunk filled with woolen blankets that smelled of camphor. Someone else suggested checking the coal chute. The family had no coal chute. They burned wood. But the neighbor to the left had one, and they checked it. A man climbed down with a lantern and found only coal dust and a few chunks of anthracite that had rolled into the corner. By 11 o'clock, the search had grown to 20 men. They moved through the neighborhood in a loose grid, calling and listening, their voices small against the hiss of snow on frozen ground. Some carried sticks to probe drifts. Others carried ropes in case they needed to descend into a well or a cistern. The constable sent 2 men to check the railroad bridge, though it stood a quarter-mile away, and the child had never gone that far alone. The mother sat in the parlor with the pail in her lap. She could no longer feel the warmth, but she kept her hands on it as though the metal might remember something her mind could not. The neighbor women arrived with bread and preserves, which no one ate. They sat in the kitchen and spoke in low voices about other children who had gone missing in other towns. One mentioned a boy in Augusta, who had walked into a snowstorm and was found 3 days later asleep in a barn, unharmed. Another mentioned a girl in Bangor who had hidden in a grain wagon and traveled 20 miles before anyone noticed. These stories were meant to comfort, but they landed in the room like stones. At midnight, the church bell rang. This time, everyone heard it. The sexton was standing in the street with the search party. He looked up at the tower and saw no light, no movement in the arched openings. The bell rang once, twice, 3 times. It rang 13 times in total. Then it stopped. The sound hung in the air for a long moment before the wind pulled it apart. The men ran to the church. The sexton unlocked the door and they climbed the stairs together, boots echoing in the narrow stone passage. When they reached the bell tower, the rope still lay coiled on the floor. No one had touched it, but the knots had changed. Now there were 14. The search continued through the night, though the snow made it difficult to see more than 20 feet ahead even with lanterns. By 1 in the morning, the constable had organized the men into 4 groups of 5. Each group took a quadrant of the neighborhood, walking in parallel lines spaced 10 feet apart. They carried sticks to tap fences and probe drifts, and they stopped every few minutes to call the child's name and listen for any response. The first group covered the blocks east of Church Street, checking behind the textile warehouses and the loading docks where freight wagons parked during the day. They found boot prints from workers, wheel ruts from delivery carts, and the tracks of a dog that had circled a trash pile before moving on. They found no sign of the child. The second group moved west toward the river, searching the narrow alleys between the brick tenements where mill families lived in rooms stacked 4 stories high. They knocked on doors and woke people who had gone to bed early. No one had heard or seen anything unusual. A woman on the 3rd floor said she had been sitting by her window mending a shirt, and she had a clear view of Church Street. She saw the search parties moving with their lanterns, but before that, the street had been quiet. She saw no child running, no adult leading anyone away, no carriage stopping at the wrong hour. The third group climbed the hill past the church and searched the cemetery where French and Irish families buried their dead in plots marked with iron crosses and limestone markers. The snow there lay smooth between the graves, and the only prints belonged to crows that had landed to pick at frozen berries on the bushes. One man noticed that a wreath of dried flowers had been left on a recent grave, and the flowers were still pliable, not brittle with frost. He touched them and found them slightly warm, as though someone had held them only minutes before. But there were no footprints leading to or from the grave. The fourth group searched the mill yards along the canal, where machines sat silent under snow-covered roofs. They checked the gear rooms and the supply sheds and the small offices where supervisors kept ledgers and time cards. In one office, they found a window unlatched. The constable examined it and found no scratch marks on the sill, no mud on the floor inside, no sign of forced entry. The window might have been left open by accident, or it might have been opened from within. Either way, the room was empty. By 2 in the morning, the temperature had dropped below freezing. The men's breath turned to fog, and ice began forming on their beards and coat collars. Some went home to warm themselves and returned an hour later with fresh coffee and tin thermoses. Others kept searching without pause, driven by the fact that a child wearing only a wool coat could not survive long in the open air. The constable returned to the house on Church Street and asked the mother to describe the last conversation she had with the child. She said it had been ordinary. The child had wanted to visit the widow for candy, then planned to return home to eat supper. The walk should have taken no more than 10 minutes. The constable asked if the child had seemed nervous or distracted. The mother said no. The child had seemed excited, the way children do on Halloween night when the rules of daylight are suspended, and the streets belonged to them for a few hours. He asked the father if anyone in the family had enemies. The father worked at the Bates Mill as a loom operator, a steady job that paid enough to rent the house and buy food and keep the child in school during the months when the mill did not require youth labor. He owed no money. He had no disputes with other workers. He attended Mass every Sunday and kept to himself the rest of the week. The constable believed him. At 3 in the morning, a man from the 4th search group returned with a piece of paper he had found in the mill office where the window had been unlatched. It was a maintenance log, the kind used to record repairs and inspections of the machinery. The most recent entry was dated November 1st, 1893, the following day. It was written in pencil, in a hand that slanted slightly to the right, and it read, "Inspected loom 17. Threads tight. No adjustments needed. Signed at 6 a.m. The constable held the paper close to his lantern. The handwriting did not match the usual supervisor's script, which was blocky and upright. This script was smaller, more careful, as though written by someone still learning to form letters correctly. He asked the father if he recognized the hand. The father took the paper and studied it for a long moment. Then he set it on the table and said nothing. The mother looked at it next, Her face went pale. She said the handwriting looked like the child's, the way the child practiced letters in the margins of the family Bible when the lessons were dull. The slant to the right, the small, careful loops, it was unmistakable. But the child had never been inside that mill office. The child had never been allowed near the machinery. And the date was impossible. It was still October 31st. The clock on the mantel showed 3:20 in the morning. November 1st had not yet begun. The constable took the paper and folded it carefully. He placed it in his coat pocket and told the family he would investigate further in the morning. But privately, he did not know what to investigate. The paper was real. The handwriting appeared genuine. And the date suggested something that could not be explained by kidnapping or accident or any scenario his mind could construct. By 4 in the morning, the snow had stopped falling. The sky remained dark, but a thin line of gray appeared on the eastern horizon where the mills stood against the river. The search parties regrouped at the base of Church Street. They had covered every accessible building within half a mile. They had checked wells and cisterns and storm drains. They had knocked on every door and questioned every person who answered. No one had seen the child after the mother watched those first 5 footprints climb into the snow. The constable stood at the 7th step and looked at the stakes that marked the prints. In the lantern light, the prints appeared even clearer than before, because the new snow had settled around them and made the depressions stand out in sharp relief. He counted them again. 5 prints ascending, none descending, and the space where the pail had been found showed no disturbance except for a single smooth depression, as though the pail had been placed there by a hand moving straight down from above. One of the men, a blacksmith who had lived in Lewiston his entire life, said he remembered a story his grandmother used to tell about steps that led nowhere. She said there were places in the world where the earth forgot how to count, and if you climbed the wrong number of steps at the wrong time, you might end up somewhere that looked like home, but was not home. He said it quietly, as though embarrassed to speak folklore in front of practical men with shovels and ropes. The constable did not dismiss him. He asked what his grandmother had said about returning. The blacksmith shook his head. She had never mentioned returning. At 5 in the morning, the sexton arrived from the church. He had not slept. He carried a ledger, the kind used to record baptisms and funerals and other church business. He showed the constable an entry from October 30th, the day before. It read, "Rang bell for evening Angelus at 6 p.m. 12 knots checked and secure." The handwriting was the sexton's own, neat and even. Below that entry, someone had added a second line in different ink. Bell rang at midnight, without human touch. 13 sounds, 14 knots found. The constable asked when the second line had been written. The sexton said he had written it himself, just an hour ago, to keep a record of what had happened. But the ink troubled him. He used black ink from a bottle kept in the church office. The second line was written in blue ink, the kind sold at the general store in small vials for schoolchildren. He did not own blue ink. He had never used it, and yet there it was in his own handwriting, recording an event that should have required his presence but had occurred in his absence. The constable examined the ledger. Both lines appeared to be written by the same hand. The slant and pressure were identical, but the ink told 2 different stories. He asked if anyone else had access to the ledger. The sexton said no, it was kept locked in a cabinet, and he carried the only key. He showed the key on a cord around his neck. The constable did not ask further. By 6 in the morning, the sky had lightened enough to see without lanterns. The search parties gathered at the church for a final briefing before the men went home to sleep. The constable stood on the steps and thanked them for their effort. He said the search would resume at noon, with fresh volunteers and a wider radius. He said they would check the roads leading out of town, the farms to the north, the lumber camps to the west. He did not mention the maintenance log or the ledger. He did not mention the knots in the bell rope or the jack-o'-lantern that had turned itself around. These details felt too strange to share in daylight, when the snow reflected the pale morning sun and made everything look ordinary again. The mother remained in the parlor with the orange pail on her lap. The father sat beside her, staring at the floor. The constable told them he would return before noon with more men and a plan to search the outlying areas. He told them not to lose hope. Children had been found after 3 days, after 5 days, after a week. Sometimes they wandered farther than anyone expected. Sometimes they hid because they were afraid of punishment for staying out too late. Sometimes they were taken by strangers but released unharmed when the strangers realized the trouble they had caused. The mother did not respond. She kept her hands on the pail, which had long since gone cold. As the constable walked down Church Street toward his office, he passed the house where the neighbor had been smoking his pipe the night before. The man stood on his porch, still awake, his face gray with exhaustion. He called to the constable and said he had remembered something. He said that when he looked away to tap his pipe, he heard a sound like fabric tearing, not loud, just a quick ripping noise the way a hem tears when it catches on a nail. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but now he could not stop hearing it in his mind. The constable asked if he had heard anything else. The man said no, just that one sound and then silence. He said the silence was the strange part. On Halloween night, there should have been children laughing, doors opening and closing, the sound of feet on steps. But after that tearing sound, the street went completely quiet, as though the air itself had stopped moving. The constable wrote this in his notebook. Then he walked back to the 7th step and knelt in the snow. He ran his gloved hand along the edge of the depression where the pail had been found. The snow there felt different, denser, as though compressed by something heavier than a tin pail. He pressed down with his palm and felt resistance, as though the snow had frozen into a solid block beneath the surface. He tried to scoop it up, but it would not break. It held its shape like river ice in January. He stood and looked up at the church. The bell hung silent in the tower. The windows of the houses reflected the morning light in blank squares of glass. The street showed the tracks of the search parties, dozens of boot prints layered over one another in a confused pattern that led everywhere and nowhere. And in the center of it all, the 5 small prints climbed toward nothing, each one clear and perfect, as though the child had stepped out of time and left only the memory of motion behind. The search resumed at noon on November 1st, with 40 men divided into teams of 8. The constable organized them by skill. One team consisted of mill workers who knew how to read water flow and current patterns. Another included farmers familiar with the fields and woods north of town. A third was made up of railroad men who understood the geometry of tracks and bridges. The remaining teams were volunteers willing to walk through snow that now reached mid-calf in places where drifts had formed. The constable divided the search area into sections measured by walking time. Section 1 covered everything within 15 minutes of Church Street. Section 2 extended to 30 minutes. Section 3 reached the edges of town where houses gave way to farmland and woods. Each team carried a pocket watch and notebook to record findings with exact times and locations. The constable wanted precision, a record that could be studied later for patterns not obvious in the moment. The first team searched the river, walking the bank from the textile mill down to the canal locks, roughly 2 miles. The water ran fast and dark, swollen by snowmelt from the hills. They used long poles to probe the shallows and grappling hooks to drag deeper sections near the stone embankment. They found nothing except an old boot that had been there for months, its leather rotted and filled with silt. The second team searched the cemetery again in daylight. They examined every grave marker and every patch of disturbed earth. They checked the stone chapel where tools were kept and found it locked. Behind the chapel, they found a length of rope coiled near a well that had been sealed with boards years earlier. The rope was new, the fibers still pale and unweathered. It had been tied into a loop with no loose ends, as though the rope had been joined to itself without a knot. One of the men tried to untie it and could not. The loop held firm, seamless, impossible to understand. They brought the rope to the constable. He examined it in the church vestibule while the other teams ate bread and cheese sent by neighbor women. He ran his fingers along the rope and found no join, no splice, no place where 2 ends had been married together. The loop simply existed, complete and continuous. He set it on the pew and did not speak about it. The third team searched the rail yards where freight cars sat on sidings. They climbed into empty boxcars and checked the spaces between wheels where someone small might crawl to hide. They walked the main line north toward Auburn and south toward Portland. At a quarter-mile north, they found a handkerchief caught on barbed wire that bordered a cattle pasture. The handkerchief was white with blue embroidery, the kind a child might carry. It was damp but not frozen, suggesting it had been placed recently. But the fence showed no sign that anyone had climbed it. The wire strands were tight and unbroken, the posts firm in frozen ground. The fourth team searched the woods west of town where logging roads cut through stands of pine and hemlock. The snow lay thinner under the trees, held back by the canopy. They found deer tracks and fox prints crossing at angles. Near a cleared area where loggers had been working, they found a single piece of orange waxed paper, the kind used to wrap penny candy. It lay flat on the snow, not crumpled or torn. The paper was still slightly tacky, as though it had been warm when it landed. They brought the paper to the constable. He held it up to the light coming through the church window. The wax coating showed no fingerprints, no creases, no sign of handling. It looked placed rather than dropped. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket with the maintenance log. By mid-afternoon, the teams had covered all of Section 1 and most of Section 2. They had found the rope, the handkerchief, and the candy wrapper. 3 objects, 3 locations, no pattern that made sense. The constable spread a map on the altar and marked each finding with a pencil dot. The cemetery, the rail yard, the logging road, they formed a triangle roughly 2 miles across. If the child had traveled to all 3 locations, it would have required walking through snow in the dark for hours, impossible for someone so small. And yet the objects existed. They demanded explanation. One of the mill workers suggested the child had been taken by someone in a wagon. A wagon could cover 2 miles quickly and reach all 3 locations by following roads, but wagon wheels left tracks, and no tracks had been found except those made by searchers themselves. Another man suggested the child had been carried. A strong adult could carry a child for miles without stopping, but carrying left boot prints and the only prints found on Church Street were the 5 ascending steps. A farmer suggested an animal might have taken the child. Bears sometimes wandered close to town in autumn before winter. A bear could carry a child the way it carried a deer fawn, but bears left claw marks and fur and the strong smell of musk. The searchers had found none of these signs, and bears did not arrange objects in triangles. Bears did not tie rope into seamless loops or place candy wrappers flat on snow. The constable listened to each theory without comment. His thoughts kept returning to the maintenance log with its impossible date, the ledger entry written in blue ink the sexton did not own, the bell that rang 13 times with no one pulling the rope. These were not marks of human action or animal behavior. They were something else, operating by rules he did not understand. At 4 o'clock, the light began to fade. The constable called the teams back and assigned new sections for the following day. He asked the men to return at dawn, rested and fed, ready to cover outer areas where woods grew thick and roads turned to muddy tracks. He thanked them and watched them disperse toward their homes, shadows stretching long across the snow. Before leaving, the mill supervisor approached with a question about the maintenance log. He said he had checked the mill office that morning and found the log exactly where it had been left. But there was a new entry, dated November 1st at 6:12 p.m., 6 hours in the future. The entry read, "Inspected loom 17, threads tight, oil level checked, signed at 6 p.m. The handwriting was the same careful script, the same slant to the right. The supervisor said he had not written it. No one on his crew had been in the office. The door had been locked all day. The constable returned to the mill with the supervisor. They climbed stairs to the small office overlooking the loom floor. The ledger lay open on the desk, the new entry exactly as described. The ink was fresh enough to smudge slightly when the constable touched it with his fingertip. He checked the date on the wall calendar, November 1st. He checked his pocket watch, 4:30 in the afternoon. The entry was dated 6 p.m., an hour and a half in the future, but the ink suggested it had been written within the last hour. He asked if anyone had a key to the office. The supervisor said only 2 keys existed, one on his belt, one locked in the mill owner's safe across town. He showed his key, still attached by a short chain. The constable examined the lock and found no scratch marks, no sign of forcing. The window remained unlatched, same as the night before. He walked to it and looked down at the loom floor 3 stories below. No ladder reached the window. No rope hung from the sill. The drop was straight and sheer. He asked if the child had ever been inside the mill. The supervisor shook his head. Children were not allowed near machinery until old enough to work looms safely, usually around age 12. The child had been 7. The supervisor said he would recognize the child by sight and had never seen that face inside the building. The constable closed the ledger and asked to take it. The supervisor agreed. As they descended the stairs, they heard a sound from the loom floor, a clicking, rhythmic and steady, like threads being pulled tight and released. They stopped and listened. The mills had been shut down for the holiday. No machines were running. No workers were present. The constable walked onto the loom floor and followed the sound to loom 17, the same loom mentioned in the maintenance log. The loom stood silent, but the threads across its frame were moving. Not violently, just a slight tremor, as though something small had brushed against them. The constable reached out and touched one of the threads. It was warm. He pulled his hand back and wiped his palm on his coat. The supervisor stood nearby, his face pale in the dim light filtering through high windows. They left the mill and walked back to Church Street without speaking. When they reached the house where the child had lived, the constable knocked and the father answered. The constable showed him the new entry in the ledger. The father studied it and confirmed the handwriting matched the child's practiced script. The slant to the right was exactly how the child formed letters when concentrating. The mother looked at it and began to cry. She said the child had wanted to work at the mill when old enough, had been fascinated by the machines and the way threads moved in patterns. The constable asked if the child had ever taken paper or pencil from the house. The father said yes. The child often carried a small notebook and pencil stub for practicing letters during walks. The mother said she had not found the notebook among the child's belongings when she searched the room that morning. It was missing, along with the gray coat and the small boots. By 6 o'clock, the constable stood once more at the 7th step. He held a lantern, though the moon had risen full and bright enough to cast shadows. The stakes still marked the 5 ascending prints, and the snow around them had hardened into a crust. He knelt and examined the depression where the pail had been found. The compressed snow had not melted despite the day's pale sunlight. It remained solid, dense, colder than the surrounding snow. He thought about the millworker's grandmother and her story of steps that led nowhere. He thought about the bell that counted wrong and the rope that had no ends. He thought about the maintenance log that recorded events before they happened, written in a child's hand. These details did not fit the pattern of kidnapping or accident. They fit something else, something men with shovels and ropes could not search for because it was not located in physical space. A voice called from down the street. The constable turned and saw the widow standing on her porch, waving a lantern. He walked to her house and she invited him inside. She said she had remembered something. On Halloween night, just before 8 o'clock, she had heard knocking on her door. When she opened it, no one was there. She looked down and saw the orange pail sitting on her doorstep. She picked it up, it was warm, and looked up and down the street for the child. She saw no one. She assumed the child had knocked and run away as a prank. She set the pail back on the step and went inside. A few minutes later, she heard knocking again. When she opened the door, the pail was gone. The constable asked why she had not mentioned this the night before. She said she had been confused, frightened by the commotion. It had seemed unimportant at the time, just a child playing games. But now, after a sleepless day, she realized it was not unimportant. The pail had been warm both times she touched it, and both times, the child was nowhere in sight. The search continued for 3 more days, though the number of volunteers dwindled as men returned to work at the mills and farms. By November 4th, only a dozen searchers remained, mostly family members and neighbors who could not accept that the child had simply vanished from 5 footprints on a snowy step. The constable organized a final sweep of the areas beyond Section 3, where the woods grew dense and the roads became trails used only by trappers and loggers. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn fabric caught on branches, no signs of struggle or disturbance. The snow had continued falling intermittently, covering whatever traces might have existed. By the afternoon of November 4th, the constable stood in the church and addressed the remaining searchers. He thanked them for their dedication and told them the official search would be suspended. The case would remain open and any new information would be investigated immediately. But without leads, Without evidence of direction or destination, there was nothing more they could do. The official report, written in the constable's careful hand and filed at the county office, listed the disappearance as unexplained. It noted the absence of footprints beyond the fifth step, the discovery of objects at distant locations, and the failure to locate any witness who had seen the child after 7:30 on the evening of October 31st. The report mentioned a maintenance log with entries dated in the future, but it did not attempt to explain this detail. It simply recorded the fact and moved on. The family remained in the house on Church Street. The father returned to his work at the mill, operating the same looms he had worked before, including Loom 17. He never spoke about the threads that had moved on their own, or the warmth he had felt when he touched them. The mother kept the orange pail on a shelf in the parlor, where it sat among other objects that had belonged to the child: a wooden top, a slate for practicing letters, a small carved horse. She checked the pail every morning. For the first week, it remained cold, just a painted tin container holding nothing but air and memory. But on the 8th morning, November 8th, she reached for it and found it warm, not hot, not burning, just pleasantly warm, as though small hands had been holding it moments before. She called the constable, who came immediately and confirmed the warmth. He held the pail for several minutes, waiting for it to cool, but it maintained the same temperature. He set it back on the shelf and had no explanation to offer. The warmth faded by evening and did not return, but the mother continued to check it every morning, and twice more over the following month she found it warm, once on November 15th, once on December 3rd. Each time the warmth lasted only a few hours before dissipating. The constable documented these occurrences in his private notes but did not include them in any official report. He did not know how to classify them. They were facts without context, observations without theory. The locals developed their own explanations. Some said the child had been taken by someone passing through town, a stranger who had seen an opportunity and acted quickly. They pointed to the handkerchief found at the rail yard as evidence that the child had been put on a train heading south. But this theory did not account for the candy wrapper found in the woods to the west, or the rope found in the cemetery to the north, or the maintenance log entries written in the child's hand. Others said the child had wandered into the woods and succumbed to the cold. They said the objects found at various locations were simply things the child had dropped while walking in confused circles, disoriented by darkness and snow. But this theory did not explain the absence of footprints or the warmth of the pail hours after it should have frozen, or the fact that the child's body was never found despite thorough searches of every accessible area within 5 miles. A smaller group, mostly older residents who remembered stories from their grandparents, spoke carefully about the number 13. They noted that the bell had rung 13 times, that 13 knots had been found in the rope, that the maintenance log entries appeared 13 hours apart. They said 13 was a number that marked thresholds, places where the ordinary rules did not apply. They said there were nights when the boundary between here and elsewhere grew thin, and Halloween was one of those nights. They did not say where elsewhere was or what it contained. They simply shook their heads and fell silent when pressed for details. The constable did not dismiss these stories entirely. He had seen too much that resisted practical explanation. He had touched the warm threads on Loom 17. He had examined the rope with no ends. He had read entries in a maintenance log that documented inspections before they occurred. These were not hallucinations or misunderstandings. They were physical facts that contradicted the laws he thought governed the world. In December, he visited the widow who had heard knocking on her door. She told him she still heard it sometimes late at night when the wind was quiet. She said it was always 3 knocks, spaced evenly, patient. She no longer answered the door when she heard it. She simply sat in her chair and waited for the sound to stop. She said she was afraid of what she might find on her doorstep if she looked. The constable asked what she thought had happened to the child. She said she believed the child had climbed those steps and kept climbing, even after the steps ended. She said some people are born with the ability to see doors that others cannot see, and some nights those doors stand open. She said the child might have walked through such a door without realizing it, thinking it was just another step toward the house with the candy and the kind old woman. And once through, The child might not have known how to come back. The constable wrote this in his notebook but did not include it in any official document. He returned to the house on Church Street one final time in mid-December. The snow had deepened, and the stakes marking the 5 footprints had been removed. The prints themselves were long gone, buried under layers of new snow. But he could still picture them clearly, each one ascending toward nothing, each one holding its shape as though frozen in time. He climbed to the 7th step and stood where the pail had been found. The snow beneath his boots was ordinary now, no different from the snow anywhere else. He thought about the maintenance log which he had locked in his desk drawer. The entries had stopped appearing after November 4th. The last entry was dated November 4th at 6:00 p.m., and it read, "All inspections complete. Loom 17 functioning properly. No further entries required." The handwriting was the child's, neat and careful, slanted to the right. He thought about the jack-o'-lantern that had turned itself around in the window. The family had kept it on display until it began to rot, and then they had buried it in the garden behind the house. The mother said she could not bear to throw it away. She said it had been the last thing the child had carved, sitting at the kitchen table with a paring knife and a small pumpkin, concentrating on getting the eyes just right. He thought about the orange pail. He had offered to take it as evidence, but the mother had refused. She said it was all she had left, the only object that still held warmth when the world insisted on cold. The constable understood. He did not argue. He simply noted in his records that the pail remained in the family's possession and could be examined if future investigation required it. As he stood on the 7th step, he heard the church bell ring. It was exactly noon. He counted the chimes. 12, the correct number. The sexton had replaced the rope after the search ended, tying 12 knots and checking them daily. The bell had rung properly ever since, but the constable could not forget the sound of 13 chimes on that first night, or the way the rope had held 14 knots the next morning. Those numbers existed outside the flow of ordinary time, and he did not know what they signified. He walked down the steps and headed toward his office. Behind him, the house on Church Street stood quiet in the winter afternoon. Smoke rose from the chimney. The parlor window reflected gray clouds and the bare branches of trees. Inside, the orange pail sat on its shelf, cold now, waiting for the next morning when it might, or might not, grow warm again. The case was never solved. The constable retired in 1902 and took his notebooks with him. The family moved away in 1898, unable to remain in a house where every creak of wood and every draft of cold air reminded them of the child who had climbed 5 steps and disappeared. The house was sold to a railroad clerk who knew nothing of its history. The church bell was replaced in 1910 after a storm damaged the tower. The new bell rang cleanly without mystery, marking the hours in perfect intervals of 12. But the locals still tell the story. They point out the steps on Church Street where the prints were found. They mention the orange pail and the way it stayed warm long after it should have cooled. They talk about the maintenance log with its impossible dates and the rope that had no ends. Some say the child is still out there, somewhere just beyond sight, carrying a notebook and a pencil, writing entries in a ledger that records a world parallel to this one. Others say the child returned to the house that night but arrived on a different November 1st, in a different 1893, where the family never lived and the steps led somewhere else entirely. The only certainty is this. On Halloween night in Lewiston, when the snow falls early and the air grows cold, some residents refuse to answer their doors after dark. They sit quietly and wait for the knocking to stop. And if they happen to own an orange pail, they check it in the morning to see if it has grown warm in the night. Most of the time it remains cold. But not always. Not always. Which explanation fits what happened on those steps? And why does the pail still remember warmth when everything else has gone cold? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.